leaders, past, present, and emerging. And just a few things. We have people here in Temple on the Park in Newtown, and welcome to people online as well. For those of us here, we make sure our phones are switched off and letting you know where the bathrooms are, which I think you probably all found now. We're fortunate to have Elizabeth McDougall Chisholm with us, and Matthew Dawson, the publisher of this book, together with Jhampa Cowden, online from the UK, though he's usually in Nepal. And Wandrat Rinpoche had meant to be here, but unfortunately, he's very busy and had to go up to the Nomad camp. So he's kindly recorded a message for us all, which will be great. And we look forward to watching that in a few minutes. And just letting you know, we're very welcome for you to ask questions. We have time afterwards to have questions between each other, and you can put those in the chat if you're online, or just raise your hand and you can answer them later. And of course, everyone here can ask questions. So we'll have Wandrat Rinpoche first, and after this, Chisholm will translate. Thank you.
Tene nga so ke tep ke cha gong ka lojin draw poke tene samba kat den tene mexar ke tene tashi dele tama she yu tene nga tara sate dongsang de tholo ta tare nga dongsang de tholo tene ke cha gong ta ta kapje khonso khonso do thi kapje ran so ta ta no de do thi tene ane ta je chasang demori ngaya bemoy te nga sangsha pha kapje so la ke pya gon ndo go tene nga sun de so ta tara nga so ta yar ka che de yeri pe chi bon do yar ka che nda ki tele pe chi bo gamon do ta na shi gamon yeri tene masar tene shoji shela tene kare usana ta ni to nga lo ne tene samba ka din khong tang tene khong ro pa kha she che nga so tene jagani Taiwan long Taiwan ne tene thor ta jana ni tene pu la ta u somri te gang ta lo ji cho no so sa so ta khong shigri khong ne tene lo ji dragona tene ne ke ta nyam po so ba khong re de yuri ne ta ne ke tene khong ke ta chi de nyam khong ke shigri ka she mo ke she shak ba na she ma yin ba ke tene te sa ngarang ke ne ke tene thong thu nyong som tene khong de yuri tene lo ji de ya ko che tishan do si tene te kong ke te ngarang la ya lo ji ya ko tisha ba ke tene yi chi yu ma ba la ke cha gon la ya tele tene pen ri te yu tene ta ra ne tene nga so chasang demori tene chirang so ke tene tana ro we ta tro we ne mziram ne san chi su ya ta se ka tene sa ri tene nga ni tu su ke chembe ta te sa ke tinda me sa che lan ro go ti tene te ke ti ka so ni ta tu ti te na tene nyam do la shu gi ma so te la gongar me ba sho tene nga rang ke ta rewan da o che ka re se ni ma tene ta ra te ya ta chirang so ma bo che ka le ma bo che gap ta te la tene te de gom jin da o che se hi sa ri sam dang ya ane chen song sing tene ti ka so nga ti ka shu gi ri ma ri te la gong ta sore shogo tene ta ra na ji ri ti te chi tang ke tene ke pya gom ba ka lo ju kan do yo me te ta jamba kar din khong ke ne ke tene ta che nyam nyong po so ba go ni tene na cho ke nyong sha ba ma yin ba ma ke ye so ba ma yin ba te gang lo ju kan do yo ba te ta jamba kar din ke pe me se ya ko shi de ri te ka so ni chogi ma mang bo yo ri ti ka so ni ta jogi ma tham je tene de so sa ri 다 개바 삼제더니 무슨 trepa 다 슬랩도 요리 드랍 무슨 trepa 슬랩도 요리 드니 다 대강 배 조기만 망보 냠냠 풍성 소바 계좌 금발라 야제 첨부체 요 말이 가서니 드니 다다 야제 요리 라강양 서바 요리 드니 다 강바 탐제라양 때서 야제 쯔도 요리 된 잠들랑 용도 온데 드니 대강 람요 말이 다다 람이 야고 요리 드니 대용도 nyong lo jun raw je tini te ta kan ta yang che chasang ke tini te ro ba jan la sa number ta go ni ke cha go ba la tini che lo ju te la tini che ke cha go ba la ya go oni ke chran to lo ko long te yuli tini ngarang ke tini te nda oni ti chabra te la tini tini te une ke tini lo ju ri ma do ke chi dong da o jen je ma ta mo ke xie chao jen je sa wa rang ni ma re khong ke tini hong tu nyong som chasang yuri 디 값은 인터넷 소설 야제 야고 요만에 이거네 ngatoka lamga phando thundo viganga loji de tata kiona ta pe msi loji yago ji toje yosa yori dine te tano tono manthoine dine kando gosa de china ba ka taro chi ta tane loji tel tene dine keja go mal phin yago thuli ke dine molam ta rewa yu nga sani te su ti tane hyo tho ma so dana dine shinjapo malaysia ni dine jamambo je leso tini te ke tandal tini te ribti tini te la gongar me ba sho than che la tini roba jangkhin da laksan chi da te la yön rongbo che la tini tusu misar ve de ne tini ta chran so ke le ka le yoro tini te la thukji che rama thukji che sho ya yo ke se de
and especially to the author of this lovely book, Jampa Khalden. La, to many Tashi delays to you. And Rinpoche is now at Dongsung Retro Hermitage, and all of the Gechak nuns are at Gechuk Gompa, currently engaged in the Kabge Drupchen. So that's the 8 Harukas extended sadhana ceremony. And the nuns are all pretty much fine. Rinpoche is also fine, and he's going to join them in a few days to finish the Drupchen with them all. In Nangchen these days, it's the height of summer, so it's a very pleasant season for them all. It's a beautiful time. And especially Rinpoche wants to say, in reference to Jampa Khalden's book, Calling the Lama from Afar, which is based on his visit to Gechak Gompa in 2005 with a few companions. And they came from India via Taiwan to China, and then they arrived in Nangchen in Tibet. And Jampa Khalden, he really knows and saw for himself what things were like at the time. So he absorbed a full experience there and really knows and saw for himself what things were like. And the story, it's not just a story of a casual visit. It's from a deep experience. And it reflects, his book really reflects accurately from this experience. So Rinpoche is really confident that that's the case, and that on the basis of the book, it will in the future bring real benefit to the nuns. And today at Gechak Gompa, the situation's pretty good. They're all doing well. And here in Sydney, Rinpoche knows that we're all gathering here for a book launch this evening, and he sends his apologies that he couldn't join us in real time, but he needed to travel today with a group of students that are visiting from overseas to an area that has no internet access. And he knows that, many people have worked hard for this event to spread awareness about the book and about the Gechak nuns. And so again, the book was written from Jampa Khalden's insight and understanding of Gechuk Gompa at the time, and not just from listening or reading about it, but from a deep experience of the place. And he put in a lot of effort to gather that experience. And he gives an excellent report. And also at the time when Jampa Khalden visited, there were still many Jogema or senior elderly nuns that were there. Today, all of those elderly nuns have passed away. And the senior nuns at Gechak are all about Rinpoche's age, in their mid to late 50s. So when Jampa Khalden visited, the situation at the nunnery wasn't very materially developed. It was considered, quite poor. And now it's materially developed, more kind of along the standards of much of the rest of the world. They have a new shrine hall. Several of the buildings have been reconstructed, and the material conditions are better. Jampa Khalden, when you went there were no roads to the nunnery. If you've read the book, you've seen that. And today there are many roads right up to the nunnery you can drive. So again, thank you from Rinpoche to those of you who've worked for this event, and all of you that work to support Gechak Nunnery with the intention that this book will bring awareness and support for the nuns. Rinpoche shares the intention of the book and of all of you, and prays at this event, and that the book can bring great benefit for all. And he thanks everybody. So I'll just say a couple of words just to sort of introduce the book before the interview with the author. You know, to me, this book is special first for many reasons. Like the first that comes to mind is the style of your writing, Jampa Khaldenla. It's so well written, but it's also written in a way that's really quite funny. You know, if you've read it, you know, there's so many anecdotes that you'll be laughing. Very relatable if you've spent any time with Tibetans, and really captures kind of the smell and the feeling and the character. So the way that you write actually kind of reflects the character of the nunnery in many ways. So it's engaging, it's down to earth, it's humorous, but it's also really clear. And then, as Rinpoche said, you were there at a time when those older nuns, many of those Jogema or elderly nuns, were still alive. And that's the thing about Getchak Nunnery. It was founded in 1892, and it's a continuum, it's a lineage that is still thriving today. And it is because of those elderly nuns. So, you know, of course, during the Cultural Revolution for about 25 years, you know, there was a hiatus. And then in the early 80s, late 70s, 80s, those elderly nuns returned, and kind of miraculously, they had all of the pieces of the tradition. So one nun had the texts, had a whole collection of the volume of texts that she had buried underground and then recovered. And then, like the nun Sherab Zangmo that's in the book, she had the Dzogchen inside that she could pass on. And then there were nuns that knew the yogas, the Tsalung yogas, and nuns that remembered the ritual arts and chanting, and nuns that were better at the sort of administration of the nunnery. And just they all came back. There was enough to reinstate the lineage. And those older nuns inspired the influx of younger nuns that joined in the 1980s. So around the time that Jampa Khaldenla you visited, you would have seen that continuum. You would have, you know, a lot of those nuns had aged. They would be in their late 30s or 40s. And those older nuns are still there and had taught everything to that new generation of nuns. But, you know, very shortly after the time of your visit, Jampa Khaldenla, the kind of material development and the modernization, it accelerated very quickly. And really, we can say that, you know, the Tibetan Plateau kind of went through the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Information and the Digital Age in a period of about 30 years. But at Getchak Gompa, that really accelerated from around 2008 and onwards. So when Jampa Khalden was there, we read there were no roads, and we get a real kind of visceral insight into the old time, you know, that original nunnery. And so your book is like a time capsule. It's something very special because it captures it on a threshold. And as far as I can see, there's nothing else in the English language that can do that or has done that. So if somebody's looking for an introduction into who these nuns are and the world that they live in, I think this is the best we have in English language. And then it's also just a very entertaining read. So thank you so much, Jampa Khaldenla, for your book, which we had as an ebook for a long time. And Leona and others were trying to kind of publish it as a paper book, and the conditions more recently came together. So it's wonderful to have it in our hands, because that also somehow is the spirit of the nunnery, to literally touch it. So thank you for that. And I'll pass this now to Matt to talk with you, Jampa Khaldenla.
Thank you, Chosm. That was a wonderful summary and introduction to the book. And hello, Jampa Khalden. I think it's been a while since we've spoken.
Good to see you again.
And just like to say welcome everyone here. It's a weird thing for me to say because I'm actually from Melbourne.
Thanks, everybody.
So it's a welcome from Melbourne, from a Melbourne person to people from New South Wales. Melbourne and New South Wales have this like rivalry, but I'm leaning more towards New South Wales at the moment, just because I'm here, I suppose. I know it's warmer up here. But I'd just like to welcome you all and thank you for participating in this event. It's wonderful to also have all the people who put this thing on. It's really humbling, actually, from a small publisher who's trying to publish quality Dharma books. And I'm really grateful that this book's now in a physical form. So without further ado, I'd just like to say that, and a welcome again to Jumper Calden. I think of this as episode 2, Jumper Calden, because we had a chat when we did the small launch for the Melbourne launch. So I might sound, I said this before, but I might sound like a broken record if I go over things twice. But many of you here and people who will watch this in the future and people online might already know a bit about the Gebchak nuns. So I just wanted to start with maybe a little bit of a hard-hitting question, which is as Buddhists, we don't sort of we're not encouraged to talk about our own meditative experiences or experiences in terms of what we go through while we're meditating. And I just wanted to get your take, Jumper Calden, on that, because the reflections and the interviews with the nuns really do form the heart of the book. So I wondered if you could just speak about that, speaking about meditative experiences as a Buddhist.
Yeah, the nuns take that particular tradition very seriously. Actually, it was quite difficult to get them to speak about themselves. You know, they're very humble, and it was only because we had a language difficulty that we actually got over that, because we had to have Wanjak Rinpoche come and translate for us from Nangchen dialect into Tibetan. And then a friend of mine, Phil, translated from Tibetan to English. And Wanjak Rinpoche, being there, was able to tell the nuns, "No, it's okay, please tell them about your experiences. I want you, it'll be beneficial," and was able to get something from the nuns. And pretty much every word that I got from any of the nuns that made any sense ended up in the book. You know, it was that precious. Yeah, other than that, yeah, some of the nuns, even with the Lama there, were very reluctant, and you could see that it was almost painful for some of them to be talking about stuff that was obviously deeply personal, deeply important to their practice, and which they taken to heart should be kept secret. I will say, when we asked any of them for any advice personally, it was very difficult to get anybody to offer any instruction, and all we'd get was supplicate the Guru. He said, night and day, summer or winter, anytime, all the time, supplicate the Lama, supplicate the Lama. And I was having trouble finding a title for the book, and a friend of it was actually Vicky Hitchcock. So, she suggested calling the Lama from afar, and I thought that's perfect. That's the one more often than anything else, Trans and others, and Chen supplicate the Guru. So that's enough.
And I was speaking with a bookseller just up the road just before we started this event, and I sort of mentioned that it's one of the few books in English that have that kind of style where people are actually talking about their own realizations or their own experiences. And I just, and you're mentioning that the benefit that could bring. I just wonder, because we as Westerners haven't sort of, we might not think about it at the moment on that level as like a human experience. Some of these things, they seem so far out. So yeah, I just wonder about that, that take on things is something very unique. And I think it will be actually very beneficial. I think Jumper Carlin, you mentioned in our previous chat, another example of that is Mingyur Rinpoche's memoir of the 3-year retreat, where he's talking about his own thought processes during that time. And I think that's, I think what you've done in preparing this book and interviewing the nuns is something very unique in that style. So thank you for that. And I do think it will be beneficial. In terms of my next question is, what do you think that we as people who are not monks or nuns, most of us aren't monks or nuns, and living, you know, fairly busy lives, 9-to-5 jobs. What do you think we can take from reading a book like this or learning about the example of the nuns?
Well, I hope anybody reading it can take inspiration, because the one thing that really struck me more than anything else was that this was a community of women who had not selected for their particular expertise or their, what's the word? They're not in any way special when they enter the nunnery. They're just, some of them aren't even interested in becoming nuns. They go there as young just to learn to write. That's how it was then. They didn't have any other opportunities. And these ordinary people end up extraordinary. And some of them in a relatively short period of time. You know, you've mentioned how the old generation of Ani Lamas were so amazing, but actually I was really surprised at the younger generation of nuns also, how many of them were already starting to have real accomplishment. And you had nuns in their late 20s and early 30s who were authorized to give pointing out instruction to nuns at the other nunneries. So they hadn't had to spend decades and decades in retreat to get to that point. So even a person who's not able to commit themselves 100%, you know, I think can still take heart that transformation is, and it may take longer than a nun who's working full time at it, but still you have a lifetime. You can do a lot in that time.
Wonderful. And in terms of integrating practice in everyday life as well, what examples can you think of that you saw at the nunnery?
Well, we were there in the summertime when we were not doing continual drubchens and practices like they do, or they did more in the winter. So they were out and about, but you never saw a nun without a mala, usually in her hand. If she was actually using both hands to be doing something, she'd have a mala in her hand. And they were just always reciting, you know, it was just integrated in everything they did. So, you know, that advice to supplicate Dharma, I think they were practicing that fairly much continuously.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jumper. And in terms of what writers that influenced you like we've mentioned, it's such a readable book. So I was wondering if you could speak about some of the influences that you had while you were writing the book in terms of writers, either books that you were reading at the time or beforehand.
Right. Well, as sort of background, I guess, I think I mentioned to you Peter Hopkirk is one of the few nonfiction writers that I found to be very readable. I'm not a great reader of nonfiction in general. I often find I bog down, but I always found his works extremely accessible. So he wrote things like The Great Game, which was about the British and the Russians and Tibet in between, and Trespassers on the Roof of the World, more about entering Tibet in the 19th century. So I quote some, or refer to some of the stories from that book, actually mentioned in my book, because they pass through the same region. But in terms of style, I guess, as you know, more directly, William Delver is somebody that I really tried to learn from. Although he's not written anything in a Buddhist flavor, particularly his book From the Holy Mountain, I found very readable and kind of closest in style to what I was trying to do. So yeah, those would be my main sort of influences that come to mind. Is that what you're looking for?
Sorry, there's a bit of a delay here. Thank you, Jampa. I actually don't have any more questions, and the sound quality is not 100%. So what I might do is now throw to Elizabeth McDougall Chosen to speak a little bit about where the nuns are now in terms of the modernization of Tibet, and in particular the Gebchak area, if that's okay with Chosen. But I'd just like to thank you, Jampa, for speaking again with us. And also I just wanted to mention it. Yeah, I just wanted to mention as well that Jampa Calden has kindly reserved the royalties for his for this book. So all those royalties will go to the Gebchak nuns. So please tell your friends, and it will be donated shortly for the royalties that have already been made and will be continuing to be paid in the future. So thank you so much, Jampa. It's wonderful to see you online again. And I look forward to working with you as an author in the future. And I hope everything is going well there over in Gombe in the UK. So I'll hand over to Chosen now.
Yeah, it was unfortunately the sound, we didn't have the best sound quality, because I would have liked to have asked Jampa Calden a few questions as well. That's okay. You never know. Probably in Nepal, you might have had a better connection. I think you're in the UK today. I think, is that right, Jampa Calden? You're in the UK?
I probably would have had better. Yes, I am. Gombe, UK.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't really have anything in particular planned. Were there any questions about how things have changed at the nunnery since, or about what you've heard here so far? I've got a few photos that I can share, which I'll do now. So this is a picture, this was the nunnery probably as it looked for Jampa Calden in 2005. And as it would have looked, so that the main shrine hall at the center, that was built probably in the 1980s. No, actually, that's not true. So when the nuns returned and the community returned at the very end of the 1970s in this valley, and this valley is where the nunnery was first settled. And this is the valley where the Sayang Gyamtso, who is sort of the founder of the nunnery and sort of the guru, you see him in the tanka and that sort of thing. This was where he grew up. He was from a nomad family, and they probably had 1,000 yak, many hundreds or 1,000 sheep. And when you read the life story of Sayang Gyamtso, who was the founder of this nunnery, he was one of the close disciples of the first Tsoknyi Rinpoche, Drupwang Tsoknyi, the great Drupwang Tsoknyi. This was in the late 19th century, and also the height of the Rimé period. So probably everybody has heard of the Rimé, so-called Rimé period. It was a period of about 200 to 300 years with very vibrant kind of non-sectarian attitude that really celebrated especially the practice lineages, and really you saw a lot of activities to strengthen lineages that had previously a quieter textual voice and a quieter maybe political voice. So you saw a lot of textual compilations happen. You saw a lot of shedras, or like monastic colleges, built sometimes for the first time in Kagyu lineages and Nyingma lineage. But what it was really doing was kind of reviving and celebrating a lot of the sort of the more marginal or less textual lineages. And this is when the nunnery was founded. And it's kind of interesting because it was a time very much inspired by a lot of Dzogchen practice and Mahamudra, and the kind of union of Dzogchen and Mahamudra. There were a lot of texts and attention given to that harmony of Dzogchen and Mahamudra in this period of time. And so the practical instructions and the experience of the teachings was the highest learning principle. And in the Rimé time, it wasn't that it was eclectic, like you would just take from different lineages and just mix it all up. On the contrary, in fact, people very much were quite committed to their own lineage. It just meant that there was great respect for all lineages in most people's minds. So if you go to Getchak Nunnery, you'll see the nuns will have images of lamas from pretty much all of the lineage that exist in Nangchen. And, probably from many hundreds of years, but certainly still today, the nuns are Getchak nuns, or you might have monks from Barum Kagyu monastery or any other lineage. But when a great master who has high realization, Dzogchen or Mahamudra high realization, is coming and offering a transmission, many people will go. Like most people will go. The Getchak nuns will try to get permission to go. So you're taking the experience from those who have embodied it. So it was a time that really prioritized the embodied experience, and you had texts and you had studies, but you didn't have such an emphasis on like just textual transmission. You had a lot of the Wang and the Trika. So Lung is the textual transmission where we've all had Lungs where you're receiving the memory of a text. You hear a lama reciting the text. And then you have Wang, which is the empowerment of a tantric deity. And for that, there are also texts involved that are guiding you through the sadhana and initiating you into the sadhana. But that also largely depends on the experience of the master, because there's a lot of symbolic teaching that happens. And then you have the Trika. So these are the three levels of transmission of most practice lineages across the Kagyu and the Nyingma and Sakya. You have the Wang and the Lung, and those both based on texts. And then you have the Trika, and the Trika is like the pointing out instructions. It's the meditative guidance. And there are the texts, like a pointing out instruction, we might find that in a text, but it will never just exist as a text on its own. It will always be in tandem with a qualified master transmitting through experience to somebody in person. So what's kind of interesting about Getchak Nunnery was, we never saw a nunnery like an autonomous spiritual community of women quite like this in Tibetan history before. So you had, the Shampa Kagyu, which was founded, sort of in a sense, founded by women, but often they would become subsumed in other male monastic traditions. And most often nunneries in Tibet were like annexes. They were an annex of a monastery and denied the highest tantric practices. So you'd see nuns do a lot of Chenrezig and lower level tantric practices and Nyungne and so on, and often cooking for the monastery. But, you know, they wouldn't be given the highest studies, and they often weren't given the highest practices. And Getchuk Gompa completely broke with that trope because, first of all, it was founded with women in mind to offer women the chance to cultivate the practices that were so celebrated during that Rime period. And so it was founded for women. And then by, I think, the 1950, they say that there were about 700 nuns there. And there's a written history that says there were like 1,000 nuns there. But at any rate, you can read in Blazing Splendor in one of the chapters, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, when he visits, he talks about just a sea of robes and a very silent atmosphere. So there were many hundreds of nuns there, but the depth of practice happening there was profound. So they very much took the opportunity and, you know, really cultivated the practice. And then the founder passed away. And the second reincarnation of Tsayan Gyamtso was reborn as the son of the king of Nangchen. And also Drupwang Tsotni, the second reincarnation, was also born as, I believe, the son or maybe the nephew of the king. So, you know, within the royal family. And that probably was one of the main conditions for the nunnery to continue to thrive without becoming subsumed. And actually, they were sometimes asked to do longevity rituals for the king and other pujas and drupchens for the king. And, you know, that never really happened very much in Tibet prior to that either. So, you know, quite extraordinary. And then during the Cultural Revolution, like, you know, most or if not every other religious institution in China, you know, it had a bit of a hiatus. And then in the late 1970s, with the open and reform era in China, religion was allowed again. And very quickly, the community regrouped. So you had probably about 50 or 60 elderly nuns that had survived the period. And they came back to the valley, and along with some of the male tulkus and yogis, because Getchuk Nunnery, although what we see in this picture and what we hear about today is a community of nuns, the nunnery itself is a community of nuns, but it's a lineage. So this is considered the mother nunnery. So it's sort of the original Gompa or Magon or mother nunnery. But it went on to have like 40 plus branches. And 4 of those were monasteries. And even from the earliest days, you had a lot of male yogins surrounding Drupwang Tsotni and Tsayan Gyamtso. And a lot of them were in the nunnery as well. And then in the very early days, there were a bit of issues because you had the monks and nuns, or the men and the women. Usually the men in those days were yogis that weren't celibate yogis. The nuns were celibate nuns, but they were doing a lot of yogic practice and tantric practices. And then there was a scandal, you know, and the Nyingma school has had many of these over history. And so when that happens, you've got to clean things up and make sure you're legitimate. And so very quickly, the community decided to have a monastery, and Drupwang Tsotni said to Tsayan Gyamtso, you must establish a monastery for the male members because this isn't going well. And Tsayan Gyamtso just wanted to do retreat. But Drupwang Tsotni said, if you have devotion to me, you know, this is what I ask of you. And Drupwang Tsotni had a great vision, you know, obviously great visionary, but in this case, great vision of Tsayan Gyamtso's karmic potential. And really guided him to help the nuns with this nunnery. And so they established a community called Raya Gompa, just sort of over the pass. And then that was a major monastery that today is flourishing, a huge monastery. So yeah, there were a lot of men around as well. And so some of those men, and some of them had been recognized as tulkus in later rebirths as well. They came and they had a big yak wool tent, and they set that up and they started to do their drupchens again. And the first drupchen that they did in the late 1970s was a men drupchen. And that's when they consecrate the Manu Ribu kind of thing. So they have herbs that they make into pills and they consecrate it. So Ade Rinpoche and any of the great masters would have been present for these men drupchens. And the nuns, you know, very deep rituals, and they consecrate the medicine. And they did that as their first drupchen when they kind of came together again. And then they just continued. And the shrine hall was then rebuilt by hand. You know, so the nuns and their male community members and a lot of the local nomads would have come with the help of the animals. and they rebuilt it from local stone and mud. And most of the buildings in Nangchen up until very recently were built of stone and mud. Those were the local materials. So pretty rudimentary, you know, and there would be leaks in the ceiling and hardly any light. And the nuns had terrible eyesight, you know, and they just got on with it. And they didn't really properly boil their tea. You know, they had a bit of sampa. If they were lucky, they had sampa because the ground barley meal didn't actually come that often. So they would have, you know, whatever kind of yak meat and whatever they had. But then that first building didn't last very long. And then Ngaksam Tugu, who's another Getchak Tugu, he rebuilt it again, maybe in the 90s. And that's the one that we see in this picture. And it's a bit better. And then that one lasted up until 2011. So Jampakadana, when you were there, this is the shrine hall that you would have spent time in. And then in 2011, this one was taken down. And then it was rebuilt with this, you know, a steel infrastructure and concrete. And this is a video here. You can see it in the background. This is a picnic in, I think, 2019. Yeah. That's and so the in front of, to the left of the yellow shrine hall that we see, there were a lot of those old mud brick quarters where some of the nuns lived. And I believe that Sherab Zangmo, who was the great Dzogchen yogini that Jampa Khalden's interviewed in the book and mentioned several times and was considered renowned Dzogchen realized master in Nangchen. She lived in this, you know, Jampa Khalden, you described this in the book. She lived in this tiny little mud brick, small hut. And I think she might have passed away there as well. And then those were cleared for the new temple. No, that's the same thing. Yeah, and then this is the background of that temple. So it looks pretty strong. And hopefully that will last, you know, longer than the previous ones did. So, you know, things really have materially developed on the plateau. If you've been there in the last 10 to 15 years, you know, Tibetan Buddhism is really in many ways thriving. And you'll see that there are some very well-built kind of most monasteries were reconstructed with modern materials. And interestingly, in Nangchen, most of those communities were at quite high altitude because prior to the last 20 years, the model of the community of the Gompa was more like a hermitage. And in fact, you only had one Shedra in Nangchen prior to the 1980s at Surmang Monastery, one of the two Surmang monasteries. So you certainly had a lot of study happening in the Kagyu and the Nyingma schools, but it wasn't a systematized. And so most of those monasteries would be doing a lot of Drupchens, and there would be study happening and, you know, lots of retreat practice on a three-year retreat center, probably in almost every community. And it's probably fair to say that every monk and nun would have done at least one 3-year retreat, just par for the course of being a monk or a nun in Gomde Nangchen. But with the modernization, it's just been very kind of rapid and drastic. So on one hand, it's globalization, you know. On the other hand, you've got a government it's a socialist government, which by worldview is materialist. And so the values of the modern population of China, you know, educated according to a kind of more materialist school system, which is really orientating its citizens to become like rational market actors. And you see the kind of impetus of modern China is very much to solve its social problems through economic development. And so you had obviously very rapid economic development of Western China Eastern China, you know, along the coast with Shanghai and the big cities. But Western China, so the Tibetan Plateau and other regions like Xinjiang and so on, they had fallen behind economically. They were at a very different level. So there was a campaign called Develop the West campaign, I think mostly during the 1990s and early 2000s maybe, which was a very deliberate drive to economically develop the plateau and other Western areas to bring it up to the standards of the East Coast. And so what that meant in a place like Nangchen is their economy went from, you know, thousands of years of being yak herding with a bit of farming, but mostly yak herding, was in a period of about 10 years kind of urbanized, and the people weren't forced, but they were kind of strongly encouraged with a lot of sort of coercive incentives to live in these newly developed kind of settlements. And then those settlements have then kind of become developed as towns, and many people now will have a family home, you know, in a town or a smaller town like Yushu. And so the kind of earth-based food economy that was so you had a lot of medicine and you had a lot of food in Nangchen before that, but now it's gone to a monetary economy. So that was a huge adjustment. And then in the monasteries, you saw some changes as well. So like Ladungar Monastery, I'm sure you've heard of Ladungar Monastery. It's, you could say in a way, it's sort of the epicenter of Tibetan Buddhism on the plateau in the last few decades. So it was founded by Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, and his vision was to basically make Tibetan Buddhism thrive in the future that he had vision of. So he wanted it to be in harmony with the Han Chinese population, to have it in both languages, and to, you know, to integrate it into the world that it existed in at the time, a very modern vision. And so what you see has happened in most of the monasteries, and it becomes very visible in Nangchen, is the Shedra model has become kind of the most common model for the monasteries and the nunneries. So in Nangchen, a lot of those nunneries and monasteries were at higher altitudes. In the last 20 years, most of them have been rebuilt at a lower altitude. And so the Raya Monastery that I just mentioned, the first monastery for monks that was built over the pass, they have now rebuilt themselves at a lower altitude, and nuns have taken over the original one as a kind of retreat center. And then, you know, most major monastery or nunnery in Nangchen will now be following some kind of systematized study program, often degree oriented. And so there's a lot of benefits for that. In many ways, that strengthens it. It equalizes the opportunities for nuns, because most other nunneries didn't have the fortune that Getchuk nuns had. But it has also changed the value system. So Getchuk nunnery, you know, from the early days, its curriculum, or rather schedule, really, its annual schedule has been full-time practice. So obviously they've got a lot of retreats. They do their Ngundro, they do a 7-month Vajra Kilaya retreat to clear any inner obstacles. And then they do the 3-year retreat, and then they join one of the retreat divisions, and they cultivate their yidam for their entire lives. And they also spend more than half of the year in these community drupchens. You know, very intense. I mean, it's a form of meditation. A drupchen it's a very intensive tantric ritual practice, but, you know, it's a very deep, creative, visual form of meditation. Very powerful stuff, right? But there was a time about 7 years ago, and the Getchuk nuns were still basically following the same curriculum that they had from the late 1892 period. But then the Tibetans started to criticize the Getchuk nuns for not studying more, and saying things like, how can you do so many tantric rituals? How can you know what you're doing if you don't study enough? And by study, of course, that's meaning like a critical philosophy type of study, because the Getchuk nuns, there's a lot of learning involved. They do, you know, obviously a great deal of learning. It's just a different form of learning. And, you know, if you meet the nuns, like, and you can come across this in Jampa Khalden's book, you get very much a clear sense that they know what they're doing. It's just not so much of an abstracted kind of intellectual explanation. So that's a change that you see in the kind of intercultural level as a result of the modernization of value. So another factor is that we've got a 9-year mandatory education for children now across China. And that's a really good thing, you know, for children to have, and again, it equalizes it, because, you know, it doesn't mean that just the monks will get educated. It means nuns, and it means women as much as men, and different class levels of society as well. For over about 100 years, there's been a rule across China that you cannot become a monk or a nun until you're 18 years old. So it also changes the demographic of the monastic population in Tibet. So at Getchuk Nunnery, you know, right now there are maybe about 200 to 250 nuns, and much higher numbers prior to the 1950s. But it's really not so sure what the longer term future of Getchuk Nunnery might look like. because it's very remote. And most younger people, if they're going to choose a nunnery, they'll often be choosing a nunnery that's a little bit more, that has the study program, and that is sort of maybe a little bit cleaner and a little bit maybe closer to a town and a part of a more scholarly conversation and is getting accolades because they're studying and so on. Getchuk Nunnery is a bit of a relic of an old time. And it's interesting because some of the nuns, the younger nuns, they wanted to bring in more study, you know, like peer pressure, because many other nuns, that's what they're doing. And they're saying these Getchuk nuns, maybe because they're like a nomad nunnery, they're not studying. And the nuns actually do have 200 of their own yak. But the Getchuk nuns deliberately had several meetings and decided, you know, by majority to not change their schedule and to not adopt more study. So they do study, they'll study Words of My Perfect Teacher and the Uttara Tantra and that kind of thing, but it's mostly the practice. So this is a couple of photos of those old Jogema nuns. The one on the right features in the book, Jampa Khalden's book, Tamke Wangmo. There's a part in the book that talks about a Drupchen when Tsoknyi Rinpoche, I think it's just when Tsoknyi Rinpoche is visited, or maybe just before that. And Tamke Wangmo gets up and they're doing the ritual dance. This one of the older nuns, and this is her on the right. And then the nun on the left, several of you here in the room have met. She had no teeth and she loved sugar. And she passed away in January of 2021. And she was the last elderly nun to pass away. And many, if not probably more than half of those older nuns are reported to have stayed in Tukdam. So Tukdam is kind of not that unusual in a place like Gomde Nangchen, you know. And like Jampa Khalden mentioned, even many of the young nuns at Getchuk will get realization, and it's not so much about how much practice they've done. It's, you know, often about their faith and their devotion. And across Nangchen, you know, it's not just at Getchuk, but you hear stories of Tukdam quite regularly. So the ways that these older Jogema nuns died was, you know, really inspiring for young women to join. If you have an inclination for Dharma, to see that is very motivating, as it looks like a sure thing. Whatever's in their recipe is working. So those older nuns, you know, that generation has passed. And now, as Rinpoche mentioned, most of the, you know, the senior nuns at Getchuk today are about his age. So that's about late 50s, I guess, mid to late 50s. And so the nun on the left is Chemchok Palmo, and she's considered an Ani Lama, and she's referred to by the other nuns and lamas as an Ani Lama. She's also called a Dorje Lopon, or a Vajra master. And she and Wangdo Rinpoche had two big thrones made for the two nuns who are Vajra masters, because they lead all of the Drupchens. So they're holding the Vajra with the cord attached to the Yidam and the Mandala, and they're, you know, they're masters of these tantric practices. And what's kind of an interesting point about Chemchok Palmo, you can see she's quite sweet looking and she's very warm-hearted, but she also cuts up the bodies of the other nuns for sky burial when they die, because they have their own charnel ground, and their last wish is often to have their body offered to the vultures. So she does that as well. And the yogi, the kind of grimy looking yogi on the right, he's also several times in Jampa Khalden's book, and that's Tokden Ngade. Do you remember the part in the book when Jampa Khalden and the others, they give him some really nice green tea, and he reacts, his face kind of has the same expression as like when we drink salted butter tea for the first time. And actually, so he lived in a nomad encampment just down the road from the nunnery. So if you've been to Getchuk, when you drive out, you drive past a nomad camp. That was where his family lived. And he passed away just 2 years ago. At the very same time that Warwick Earl passed away, was one of our dear friends and one of Wangdo Rinpoche's students in Blackheath, an older man that passed away with great devotion to Getchuk, great devotion. And he passed away at the same time as Ngade, which was nice. Yeah, so this is, you know, what you see now at the nunnery is young nuns will be sent up to the nunnery about this age, which is much younger than it used to be. In the past, they might join in their early teens, but now they're sending them at this age because once they're of school age, about 8, they'll have to go to state schools in towns. So it's almost like a cultural kind of catchment that many families will send their youngest daughters to the nunnery to learn to read the scriptures and to participate in the drupchens and to be with their older aunts or cousins or sisters and get the blessing of the nunnery. But many of these young girls will then have to maybe disrobe and come back to the city, to the town, to go to schools. Some of them manage to stay, but most of them don't because there's a census and that kind of thing. So the future of the nunnery, it might sound a bit kind of sad and disappointing to hear all the changes, but it's quite remarkable to see how well the Tibetans in Nangchen at least are adapting. So yes, there's been this big drive to a Shedra model, and it had to have, you look at Ladungar, for example, and this big move to the Shedra, but you try to imagine if that hadn't happened, what would Tibetan look like? Just a bit like the Rime period. In order for your tradition to be, fortified, you do need a stronger textual voice. You need to be able to speak in the terms of a modern skeptical audience. And also, a lot of the lamas in Tibet nowadays, Ladungar, many of their students are Han Chinese, so they're teaching in Chinese language. Most of the sponsorship is coming from mainland and diasporic Chinese around the world. So what we've got today is a hybrid. If we talk about Tibetan Buddhism today on the plateau, it's a hybrid Tibetan Chinese Buddhism. And it's, quite a beautiful thing for, the social harmony of the place. And so that's one kind of incredible way that it's adapting. But in Nangchen, there was a bit of a time when it was such a very strident push to the study model. And it was like, whoa, we're losing our practice. And actually the head lama, one of the head lamas of Ladungar, he said, if we're not careful, in 20 years, we'll have our lung, so the transmission of the texts, but they're going to lose the wang, the empowerment, and the trika, meditative instruction forms of transmission, which are based on experience, because it was too much of an emphasis on just the textual philosophical study. So they recognized this is where they were headed, and they've tried to kind of, balance it out. And so now in Nangchen, you see a lot of lay people participating in retreats and a lot of like 100-day winter retreats. They call them chapja, when many monks and nuns will just for 100 days in the winter, but many lay people will do that too if they have the time. And kind of Getchak Gompa, because when you see this nunnery at 4,500 meters and you see that the population is kind of dwindling and actually people get altitude, the Tibetans, including the nuns, are getting altitude sickness too, strangely, because they're traveling up and down. They go to town to buy their groceries. They go to town for the doctors, to visit their family, and they're going up and down. So they get altitude sickness at the nunnery now. And so a lot of the older nuns also struggle with that. And so Wangdor Rinpoche has been developing Dongsang Retro Hermitage, which is at a lower altitude just across from the town for about the last 10 years. And it's in a very special place historically for Gomde Nangchen. It's where Tishirepa meditated in the 12th century, and his cave is there. And Tishirepa, in a way, was one of the visionaries of the kingdom of Nangchen. He was maybe the root guru to one of the first kings or something, a Barong Kagyu lineage. And so Rinpoche has been developing a hermitage there, and he's got a 3-year retreat center as a training hub for the Getchak lineage, because there are many of these branch nunneries and monasteries across Eastern Tibet, quite scattered, quite far across Eastern Tibet. And so those nuns from those branches will come to this 3-year retreat and be trained by older Getchak nuns from Getchak Gompa in their practices, their Drupchen style and their meditation and stuff. And then many of them might go back to their branches. And then those older nuns, and, it might just sort of develop as more of a hub of the Getchak lineage, or at least it's a backup as a kind of more viable place to live for the lineage. So I'm probably far over talked my time here. So if there are any questions, do you know what time it is, anybody? Is it 7:30? Yeah.
We're just coming up to the end, but
Chuzan, we do have 2 questions online. If you,
Oh, yeah.
So there's one question which is asking, has the number of nuns at Gebchak increased noticeably since Wandrak Rinpoche was appointed abbot, or has it been a steady increase since they could safely return to the nunneries?
It's been the main increase happened after the Cultural Revolution in the 80s and 90s. That was when a huge influx came. And then it was sort of more steady. And so I wouldn't say that there was a noticeable increase after Wangdrak Rinpoche was enthroned. But it certainly, you know, that for them to have their tukus back was really strengthening for the nuns. So Wangdrak Rinpoche and 3 or 4 other local tukus are, you know, a part of their ritual life and look after them. And it's, you know, really strengthens their commitment.
And the second question relates to the book, asking, does the book contain some pointing towards practice guidelines along the lines of how the nuns are practicing, or is that kept more closely held in secret and not specifically disclosed in the book?
Jumpa Calden, do you want to try? Do you want to try answering that? If you still have your microphone there. Jumpa Calden, do we stay up? Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's a bit kind of we can hear you, yes.
Right. Yeah, I didn't try to put any kind of systematic guidelines in the book. It's not that kind of a text. It was very much just whatever the nuns were willing to share with us. But something that I've discovered for myself lineage, one of Tsoknyi Rinpoche's lineages. And I realized that they don't attain realization because of special practices. They have the same practices that everybody else has. They just do them, whereas the rest of us make excuses, crazy about practicing. They get on with it. And Gompa, these nuns, get stuck in and really put in their hard yards. And that's what it's about. It's not about particular practices. It's about doing whatever practices your Lama gives you. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that I think that hit the mark for many people here in the room.
Anyone have any questions? Anyone from here have any further questions? Jumpa Calden or Matt or yeah? Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Could you just repeat that answer because I'm hard of hearing and I didn't hear the answer to that last
Jumpa
question.
Yeah, I can try and summarize it just because Jumpa Calden's audio might not be the best. So from what I remember of Jumpa Calden's answer is there isn't any systematic, there's no systematic detailed instruction in terms of meditation in the actual book. But Jumpa did say that one thing that does come through in the book is that the realization that the nuns have is due to their hard work and because they actually do the practice and put in the hard yards, so to speak. So I think that's the best I can do with summarizing what Jumpa said.
PhD, and that's really what struck me in reading Chosm's PhD quite a while ago. Now, what really struck me is that they may not necessarily know why they're doing everything, but they're just doing it. And with that faith and devotion and belief that that's,
yeah, that's what they're meant to be doing. So, yeah, doing the hard yards, but incredible. Yeah, thank you. When is your book being published? Thank you.
Is there any questions from online? Any further questions online? Maybe people want to unmute and fire a question away. Just give some time. Okay, it seems like no further questions online.
Yes. So, well, thank you. Thank you for everyone online and here at Temple on the Park. And a particular big thank you to Jumper Cowden, La. Yeah, we are so grateful for you writing this book. And it's just been such a pleasure to hold it as a paperback and to, you know, read it and look at the photos and everything else. So thank you again. And to Chisholm, with your wealth of information, it's just wonderful. And the stories, we could listen to you all evening. And to Mac, to make it happen. You actually had this vision and went for it. Yes. So we're extremely grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, I just want to mention once more to Jumper Cowden, thank you again for offering these royalties to Gebchak Gompa. Rinpoche, and you know, is so grateful, and it's of such benefit to the nuns. So thank you again.
Leona,
Glad to hear that.
how are we going to be able to get the book up in the mountains?
Wh-
It's
who-
Nolene.
I can't who.
It's Nolene. Can
Oh,
we
it's
buy-
Nolene. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
Oh, no, I'm in
yes,
the shadow, aren't I? It's can we get the book up here at the mountains?
Yes, yes. You can get it from Margaret Bowler or
Okay.
from myself, and
Okay.
we'll get a copy to you. Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thank you. Goodbye.
Right.